Good afternoon. My name is Mark Rosekind. I'm a board member with the National Transportation Safety Board. I want to take an opportunity to reintroduce the investigator in charge on this accident. So this is the IIC, Howard Plagans, that's P-L-A-G-E-N-S, who's been in charge of the investigation from the beginning. I also want to acknowledge the responders. We've talked a lot about the first responders, but we have some responders who have been on site not just at the beginning but throughout this investigation, providing everything from security to on-site medical assistance, and their ongoing support has really been critical to the investigation. I also want to extend our thanks to the Reno Tahoe Airport Authority. From the instant the accident happened, they've provided just critical support and cooperation from the beginning and throughout the investigation, and we extend our thanks to them as well. What I'm going to do this afternoon is just talk about two things. New information that's been found today, and I'm going to go through that actually fairly slowly because there's some what we consider fairly significant new information that's emerged. And then we'll talk about what's coming next, so what the future steps are in the investigation. For new information, first of all, there had been reports about a mayday from the pilot. Thus far, our investigators have found no information of a mayday call from the pilot. Next, the investigators have found that the accident aircraft was equipped with a video camera facing outward. They have also found camera fragments at the wreckage site. And among the wreckage site, they have found multiple memory cards that could have come from the camera. Clearly, we can't tell at this point whether or not any of those memory cards are from the accident aircraft. And so those memory cards, all that have been found, will be sent to the NTSB Research and Engineering Laboratory in Washington, D.C. for analysis. Obviously, the first thing is to determine whether any of them actually came from the accident aircraft, and then whether any of the images or data available will be relevant to the accident investigation. Related to that, if that analysis allows our investigators to actually determine any personal information, so if there's a memory card that comes from someone, some information that's not related to the accident aircraft, and there's personal information available, those memory cards will actually get returned to those individuals, just so you know what we do with that information. But I'm going to repeat, there was a camera identified, video camera. Fragments were found, memory cards have been identified. All of those will be going to the Research and Engineering Laboratory in D.C. to determine if they actually have any video images from the accident aircraft. Next, our investigators have also found that this particular aircraft had a recording system that recorded multiple variables on both memory card and through telemetry transferred the data to the racing team crew. A box with a memory card has been found that could have come from the accident aircraft. That will have to be determined. We'll talk about that in just a moment. We do have the telemetry data that has already been examined and will be sent for further analysis to Washington, D.C. I'll talk about that as well. It has multiple variables, including information from the engine, such as oil pressure and oil temperature, but also includes GPS information, altitude, velocity, latitude, longitude, and other variables. These could be critical for us to perform analysis that would allow us to examine certain structural or medical issues based on this information. As far as the next activities, the on-scene wreckage documentation is complete. There's a goal that today the on-scene wreckage recovery will be finished, and that's where the components will be taken and moved to a secure facility for later analysis. And the goal is also to return the wreckage and accident site to the airport, and for them then to be able to do final cleanup of the site. 5 different things are being sent to the NTSB Research and Engineering Laboratories in Washington, D.C. They include components that we've mentioned over the last day, primarily trying to determine first if they were actually from the accident aircraft, second determining their status. Those will be sent. We'll be sending camera memory cards. We'll be sending the accident recording system memory card. So remember, two separate things, the camera as well as the recorded telemetry data. And then we'll also be sending all the photos and videos. Again, we have discussed this, that there's been, because of the race going on, a tremendous amount of photos and videos are available for analysis from this accident. So those are 5 different things. And I want to highlight this as a great example of part of what our investigators have done in barely over a day, is collect factual information here to be able to send to Washington, D.C. for further analysis. So we've just identified some very significant information that will go for analysis in Washington. You should also know that a preliminary report of the accident will be available 5 business days from the accident, which means that this Friday, if you go to the NTSB website, ntsb.gov, they will publish a preliminary report. Just to be clear regarding expectations, it will be a review and summary of the information available to date. So how much more beyond what we've already talked about is unclear, but Friday a preliminary report 5 days after the accident will be available on the NTSB website. We'd like to take some questions. We're going to first, operator, queue up if you will.
Thank you, sir. If anyone on the call has questions or comments, please press star 1. At this time, please remember to unmute your phone and record your name clearly so that I may introduce your question. Again, that's star 1 for questions or a comment. One moment.
Great. We'll start with questions here, please.
Talk about this memory card more detail, transfer the data. Did you get the card from the race team, or did you find the card at the wreckage site?
So just to be clear, this is the aircraft recording system. Actually recorded the data in 2 ways. Onto a memory card, but it's also transmitted by telemetry to the racing team crew. So a box with a memory card was found. Still has to be determined if it's from the accident aircraft. But the other form, which is the telemetry transmitted data, is already in NTSB possession and ready for analysis.
That's the same information?
And the question is, I'm sorry, first was, where do we get this information? It's actually 2 different kinds of information, memory card and telemetry, and yes, they're both the exact same information. One saved onto a memory card, one transmitted.
Would you liken that to what we normally call a black box? Is that sort of similar kind of system?
So the question is it similar to a black box? It's different. And I think the main way to think about it is this is sort of a smaller version, smaller number of variables recorded. And just to give you a sense, those black boxes in commercial aircrafts now contain thousands of variables. And I would think here we're not even hundreds probably. Couple dozen variables. Okay. But I think what's important is that for this accident, where we were wondering would we even have information like this, this is very significant for the accident investigation.
This information is sent by telemetry. Is that real time, like up to the second?
So the question is the telemetry data at real time up to the second? And it is in real time, but I don't know what the transmit, do we know?
We haven't determined that, no.
So it is in real time. That's a great question, though, about how often it's sampling, and that we don't know until we look at it.
The camera video card, is that a similar kind of card that you find in a consumer device? And can you explain what kind of shape it was in? Was it angled or was it tacked?
So the first part, which is, the question is what shape was the camera memory card in? And part of the question is it's sort of the standard kind that any consumer might use. And I believe it's,
yes.
Yeah, so the memory card's the same kind that you might have in your own video recorder. And what's critical to understand is that we have found a whole set of memory cards in the wreckage area. And so that's the issue, which is it could be from anyone's video camera or other camera that was at the wreckage site. So that's why the ones that have been found all have to go to research and engineering in Washington to determine, did we get the one from the accident aircraft, and can the data be retrieved sufficiently to add some kind of image information for our analysis.
Just to follow up, so you found multiple camera cards?
Yes, and so there were multiple memory cards in at least good enough shape to send for analysis. Can we take a call from the phone? Question from the phone?
At this time, there are no questions.
Thank you. I'll go back here in the back. Yep.
Yesterday, you said you had found a piece that might have been part of the missing tail mechanism. Is there any more information on that?
There's no, the question is, yesterday we reported finding, identifying and recovering components of the tail system. And is there an update to that? We really haven't any more information, and as I have tried to continually, describe, we don't even know if that's from the accident aircraft for sure. And to be clear, part of the reason we send this to the materials lab is to determine, is that from the same aircraft, and then can we analyze it for some kind of fault or problem that would tell us more about what happened in the accident.
Can you help clarify where in proximity to the crash that part was found, and whether you think it came from the plane, or if it came from the plane, whether it would have come before, during, or after the steep climb?
So the question is where we found the part, and is there a way to determine whether it came at what point of the climb, etc. And what we can say is that part of the reason we focused on this component is because it was at least in the vicinity of where people observed a piece possibly being part of this accident sequence. Hence, well, the question is where was that exactly? Where sort of it was observed and where it was found? Because it wasn't at the wreckage site, right? It was at a...
This piece was found more over by the towards the home pylon area, but we did a search from the home pylon down through turn 8, the home pylon, and this was a piece that was identified that was of interest. At this point, again, we have to analyze where did that come from.
How far from the wreckage was it? Quantify that distance?
Mile? Less than a mile, but I can't quantify. That'll be part of the analysis part of once we get the grid laid out. That'll have to be determined.
And two things. One is, partly you're now getting a sense of the complexity. Where was it? That's why we had the Reno Police Department and the Nevada Highway Patrol using their very sophisticated mapping so we can actually calculate all these things. And to the second part of your question, really at this point there's no way to tell at what part of the sequence it might have actually been related, because right now we don't even know if it's a component from the accident aircraft. Again, that's why this has to go to the materials lab to determine was it actually part of the aircraft. Yes, sir.
Does the aircraft recording system have competent audio, and was that the basis for determining that there was no Mayday call, or was that separate to radio?
So the question is whether the aircraft recording system had any audio. Was that the basis for determining whether there was or was not a Mayday call? No audio?
Not that I don't know. That would be...
So we don't really... Okay. So again, an example of we don't know if there's audio. We're going to have to look at the analysis to determine what's actually there. And clearly we haven't had that, so determining there was no Mayday call has not come from there, but has come from the investigators looking at other sources.
This recording equipment, is that unusual in a race like this where a pilot could be transferring data like this? Is that unusual?
So the question is whether an aircraft having this kind of recording system is unusual or not. Howard?
I'm not aware of a lot of aircraft having it. This is the first one I've come across, but it's certainly possible.
Question in the back? Yes, sir. I'm sorry. So the question is whether the team came to us immediately to tell us that really either of these systems, the camera or the recording, actually existed. And no, this is part of the investigation process. And so through multiple interviews, and as you know, you've asked, is there anything available? And it's taken us some time through interviews to actually discover that these were not only possibly on the aircraft, but could we find some fragments or other pieces that could be used for analysis. And I remind you, we are now in the second day of the investigation, and I think, if anything, it really shows how very quickly our investigators have been able to get through so much information, which is why I identified 5 different pieces of pretty major areas that are going back to our materials lab and the research and engineering for analysis.
To that point, this might be for Howard. Could you give us a sense, I mean, memory car's fairly small, this is a fairly catastrophic accident. Can you give us a sense of how the investigators worked, how they sifted through this debris, or able to find these items?
So the question is how the investigators were actually able to sift through the wreckage to identify the memory cards. And I think it'd be great for Howard to take a moment to tell us that, because I think it gives all of you some appreciation for the meticulous and detailed and thorough work these people do. Those of you that have now seen the wreckage site understand what they were looking for there. And if you can describe a little bit of what your folks went through.
Basically, the team, in working in conjunction with the Nevada Highway Patrol and doing the grid system to lay out the pieces, our structural people would go through with them in a grid, identify pieces of interest, and it takes multiple trips. You don't just walk through and see everything on the first pass. You have to make multiple trips. But as they were walking through, they would find a SIM card, basically a memory card, just like any of your cameras. Obviously, because of the severity of the accident, they're contaminated with different kind of fluids and just dirt and dust from being just randomly out on the ramp. So that's why you have to identify, and there's multiple cameras, pieces that are out there. So there's literally thousands of pieces of debris that they walk through the grid system multiple times to identify these pieces. Nothing was found completely on the first pass.
Can you analyze, do you pick it up and box it and send it to Washington, D.C., or can you see anything as you're here today?
So the question is, do we box everything up and send it to Washington, D.C., or can we analyze some things on site? Again, it's really important to know the first part of the investigation is all the gathering the factual information. That's what's done here. And in this case, we have a lot of it, the factual information and data sources to send back for analysis. That analysis is not done here. It's just the gathering of information. And I said this before, I'm going to repeat it. The accident was almost instantaneously. It will take months to come up with what actually caused this accident. Because what's critical is not just, what caused this, but why. Because if we're going to make recommendations, if the NTSB is going to make safety recommendations, it's not just what happened, it's why did it happen. So our recommendations are focused on making sure it doesn't happen again. Hence the required very thorough analysis.
Which brings me to my second question. What input would you have, if at all, whether these air races continue in the future? What kind of input would the NTSB have? What call can they make on that?
So the question is sort of what role the NTSB might play in whether air races continue into the future. Briefly, the FAA has in their flight standards area a division specifically focused on oversight, and we found there are 7 people in that division that have oversight for air races and air shows. And I refer you to them to understand more completely what their process is, which includes coming up with a comprehensive plan for any individual race or show. And so as far as the NTSB role, I'm going to go back and highlight again, what's the NTSB looking at? We have a comprehensive investigation that's going to look at the human, the machine, and the environment. The human, in this accident, that's medical status, age, training, type ratings. The machine, well, in this case, we've been talking a lot today about the aircraft and what can we learn. And then the third, of course, is the environment. And that's not just the weather, but it's talking about the environment of oversight. So the NTSB, as part of this investigation, will thoroughly examine the FAA's current procedures, what comprehensive plan was in place for this particular race, whether it was followed or not. What say can we have? 2 things. One is, based on our analysis and findings, if appropriate, the NTSB can issue a safety recommendation to the FAA. What that has to do, I have no idea. We can't say. That is yet to come. However, we can make a recommendation directly to the FAA about these issues. Second, if during this investigation we find that there is in any way a critical issue we feel needs to be addressed immediately, then we can issue an urgent safety recommendation to the FAA or any other entity that we feel could address what was found in this accident. So we don't have to wait to the end of the accident investigation to issue a report. And our role, which is not enforcement, that's the FAA's job, or oversight, but we do make recommendations regarding safety to them at the end, if needed or appropriate, Or if we find somewhere along the way, we could issue an urgent recommendation as well. If we can take a question from the operator.
Thank you. The first question comes from Mr. Frank. Please go ahead. Your line is open.
Hi, thanks very much. I wanted to follow up on that question. Really, two questions. Has the NTSB issued safety recommendations at any time previously for air races?
So the question is, has the NTSB ever issued a recommendation related to air races? And in fact, in 1972, the NTSB did make a recommendation related to separation of the aircraft from the spectators. And if you want more information about that, we can provide it. That was closed in an acceptable action a long time ago. So it was issued in 1972, but it was closed in acceptable action at that time.
I could follow up. Is this the first time that spectators have been killed at an air race?
The question is whether this is the first time that spectators have been killed at an air race.
That's something we'll look at.
I was going to say, I think this is another example of part of the work that is to come, and some of these questions have come up over the last day or so, is there's a lot of information for us to understand about these races, fatalities, injuries, etc. So that will be part of what we'll be looking at going forward.
We have time for 2 more questions, please.
And let's do that. 1, 2, go.
Can the NTSB compel or subpoena the FAA to come forward with any documents relating to air race safety? Or is it just simply a matter of cooperation between?
So the question is whether the NTSB can require or subpoena documents from the FAA as part of our investigation. And yes, that can happen. And that can happen in multiple ways. If needed, and not just the FAA, but an investigation, if needed, subpoenas can be issued to acquire information. And at times, the NTSB will also hold a hearing, a public hearing, which is to continue fact-finding and investigation. If needed, subpoenas can also be issued then to get people to participate in those hearings.
Are any of these memory cards SD cards, secure digital, standard consumer type?
So the question is whether any of the memory cards that we're going to be sending are SD, kind of standard consumer type cards. Do we know that at this point?
No.
Yeah. No, I think those are the kind of things that'll need to be determined once they're sent to the Research and Engineering Lab in Washington, D.C. Last, excuse me, let me just finish up here because 2 very important points. One is the on-scene investigation is going to continue. And just so you know, there are more interviews, historical records, and other kinds of investigations. So Mr. Plagans and his colleagues will be here on site for a period of time. The second thing is we expect at this point that this will be the final formal briefing. However, you can follow us on Twitter. Most of you are now familiar with Kelly Nantel, Director of Public Affairs, and our other NTSB Public Affairs officers that are here as well. So whether through Twitter or through ongoing contact with Public Affairs, you'll be able to get other information about the investigation. So, thank you.